Hello, everybody. My name is Katie Conroy. I'm the Education and Engagement Specialist at the Maine Maritime Museum. I'm so happy that you could all join us for our very first lecture as part of the Sea Change series. If you have not already done so, I invite all of you to visit the Sea Change exhibit. It will be up until December 2023. It is a wonderful exhibit, and now, thanks to Bath Savings, we have free admission until the end of March. So stop on by one of these weekends and come check out this exhibit. A little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I will be monitoring them, and at the end of the session, I will be reading out the questions for Dr. Steneck to answer. Now, our first lecturer is no stranger to Cash's Ledge, where our exhibit gets its inspiration from. Dr. Bob Steneck is a marine ecologist, a conservation biologist, and a professor at the University of Maine School of Marine Sciences. Throughout his career, Bob Steneck has studied the structure and function of coastal marine ecosystems at his laboratories in the Gulf of Maine, the Alaskan's Aleutian Islands, Norway, and throughout the Caribbean and Indo-Pacific Oceans. His study examines organisms vital to these ecosystems and the people that rely on them. By applying ecology to human marine resource management, his studies have been enormously useful for people who make their living from the sea. His current focus includes Caribbean coral reefs and lobsters, sea urchin, and kelp forests of the Gulf of Maine. And now, without further ado, I present Dr. Bob Steneck.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to go into my screen share, which unfortunately is something I've had to do an awful lot of with my COVID teaching. Let me change a few things here. Okay, great. I'm really happy to be able to share my experiences that I had at Cash's Ledge. And the title of my talk, Cash's Ledge, Maine's Lost World. And I'm hoping that you'll understand where I'm coming from on this as the talk unfolds. So first, I'd like to present my introduction in effectively three parts. First of all, I'd like to just give you a little bit about background with me and my journey of discovery in Maine. There's obviously a historical component here, and given that my age, I'm getting better at that. And I really would like us all to be thinking about what was natural and what was lost in North Atlantic coastal ecosystems, because I have to admit, I was totally fooled by that. But the good news is what exists on Cash's Ledge and really nowhere else. And so let me get started with this. And I'm going to try to give you a sense of sort of like where I'm coming from. As a child, I loved water and I loved dinosaurs. I grew up in the New York City area, used to go to the American Museum of Natural History, and I just, I love dinosaurs. I used to make little dinosaur models, and I can remember so well reading Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World. The Lost World was, to me, it was a very plausible idea that there is this plateau in the Amazon where, for some reason, the dinosaurs didn't go extinct, and they're all still there. And I've always thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a place where ancient predators still existed? And that just struck me. And my background goes way back. The bottom line is that really I started my journey in marine biology as a student 50 years ago. My very first research project was at a now defunct lab in St. Croix called West Indies Laboratory. And I took my first marine ecology course there. And the professor, who's smiling in the back of the left photo, was explaining rather glibly that there's this global pattern where tropical coasts are dominated by fish, but northern areas like Maine are just dominated by invertebrates. It's just, you're not going to see fish. And so, I've worked all over the world in the tropics, and I have to admit, yeah, the tropics sure has lots of fish. And so then in 1974, I came up to Maine to start my master's degree at the University of Maine. And I was a scuba diver. All of my research is underwater, and everything that I saw really looked like what I was told to expect in northern cold climates. And it all made sense. So if you were all diving, if we took you all diving today, this is the kind of scene that you'd see. There's a crab, there's another crab right there. You see a lobster coming in. There's some mussels there that they're feeding on. See the kelp. You're not seeing much in the way of sea urchins in this picture, and you won't. The lobster, of course, is incredibly abundant, and everybody knows that the lobster is our cash cow. The current Maine maritime heritage is being maintained by our lobster fishery. But the question I should have asked is, what was natural? If we could go back to the very first people who were making their living on the coast of Maine, what would they tell us? What was their life like? Because one of the things we know is that there were a lot of settlements in coastal Maine. Well, obviously I can't go back and ask those people, but for those of you who recognize this is Penobscot Bay, Vinyl Haven, and North Haven. And on North Haven Island is the Turner Farm. And its distinction is that it's one of the best studied archaeological sites in the Gulf of Maine and in the Western North Atlantic. It's been meticulously studied starting in the 1970s. All of the fossils are in the Maine State Museum. And I worked with Bruce Bork, at the time was the Maine archaeologist, and I had access to those fossils, and it's just fascinating what you find. What you see on the left, those are fish hooks that were carved out of deer bone that's almost 5,000 years ago. That's a codfish vertebrate. That's a centimeter scale, but I can tell you that vertebra for that cod is bigger than any of ours. That was a huge cod. So we know that there were cod in this system, and that's interesting because as a scuba diver, I wasn't seeing cod while I was diving. So we got into other people have actually published on the bone fragments, and you can work out the density of different, the abundance of different species. And what you see is that over between 400 and 4,500 years ago, that cod were the dominant bone fragment, and there was also flounder. Number 3 is sea mink. That's an extinct mink, went extinct in the 1800s in the Gulf, on the coast of Maine. Interestingly, there's sea urchins, so there is an invertebrate there. Really, quite surprisingly, there is a great white shark. I don't know how people, when they just had spears and dug out canoes and other canoes, that they could get a great white back, but they did. But to me, the most interesting aspect of this big compilation isn't what was there. It's what wasn't there. There are no fragments of lobsters or crabs. And I happen to know that there are a number of archaeological sites in Japan and the Pacific Northwest where crab parts come up readily. It's not a preservation problem. So why something that is so obvious and abundant that I see on every single dive, we're not seeing at all in this is basically the garbage heaps of the ancestral Indians that lived on the coast of Maine. In another site, and this is one near Booth Bay, about 85% of the bone weight was codfish bones. So not only were the codfish obviously abundant in the past, we could actually take those vertebral diameters and we can reconstruct body size. And what this is saying is that for most of the last 4,000 years, on average, these cod were about 1 meter in length. And we know from historical records back to the 1800s that cod can get to be 200 pounds. I also know as a canoeist that there's no way you're going to get a 200-pound cod into a canoe without upsetting the canoe. So my point is this: they were big cod, and they looked like they were on the coast of Maine, because I'm pretty sure that the Native Americans were not going far offshore. So this has me thinking about what the food web looks like. And we call it a trophic system or a trophic cascade. And the cascade is how these different critters interact with one another. You have apex predators, and one of the biggest with a big mouth is a cod. It's a carnivore. And so when it's abundant, its prey, which could include things like sea urchins, which is the only herbivore on the coast of Maine, lobsters and crabs. So you'd expect if there's lots of predators, you may not have a lot of those prey around. In that you only have one herbivore, and if it's being eaten by cod and other things, then in fact you might expect that there aren't many herbivores, so you'd have a seaweed system with lots of fish. And that's, that you could say that's kind of a theoretical viewing of what the Gulf of Maine looked like. Cod and other predators were an important part of Maine's coastal ecosystem, and it's obviously not one that I saw when I was scuba diving on the coast of Maine. Other work that Bruce Bork and others did, which is interesting, and by the way, there's not going to be a lot of science in this. It's mostly going to be pictures and storytelling, but I have a little science right now. This involves looking at stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, and you can get those out of any bone, any shell. And what it tells you is it tells you where the carbon was originally produced. So if it's floating plants, which we call phytoplankton, it's going to be kind of in the middle of this plot. If it's going to be in the upper right-hand corner of this plot, then that's what you typically get in the near shore, whether it's seagrass, kelp, rockweed, all of those would be in the upper right-hand corner of this plot. And when we look at what came up in terms of these ancient cod, sculpin, which is another fish, and flounder, they're in the upper right-hand corner. That means they were definitely living on the coast of Maine. They were not offshore. And then with some pieces of human bone, the analysis was done, and it found that it mapped close to those cod and sculpin. That's really interesting, because a lot of people thought that the earliest people primarily subsisted on things like deer and bear, but on this plot, that's the bottom left-hand corner. So this really suggests that coastal people were living, that these people were living on the coast. And when you look at the bone fragments over time, you look at the proportion of different things, you see the top predators were really abundant early on, over 4,000 years ago. Then they declined somewhat. And some of the smaller prey items, which include tomcod and sculpins, that's an ugly fish that only a mother could love, they are actually more abundant. And what this suggests is there may have been very near shore effects of these, thousands of years of seafood people. But we get a couple of very important take-home messages here. The first people on the coast of Maine ate seafood as soon as they arrived. That's really interesting. We also know that cod were abundant and present in shallow coastal zones. And cod and other predators may have declined locally before European contact. But what do we know about the first Europeans who got here? Well, interestingly, the famous Weymouth voyage had a naturalist named Rozier, and Cape Rozier is named after this. And this publication was done in 1605, and that's an illustration showing the Weymouth expedition sailing up Penobscot Bay. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is a quote saying that they were finding, quote, great cods and haddocks, which gave us a taste of great plenty of fish wherever we went upon the coast. So we're talking now that starting over 4,000 years ago, right up to 1605 at least, we had these big predatory fish. As a matter of fact, going to the 1920s, the earliest fisheries people, starting in the 1800s, but by 1920, all of those plots along the coast of Maine are plots showing where the fishing grounds were. So we know that we had these relatively large predators up and down the coast of Maine. And old pictures from the 1880s on Monhegan show how big some of the cod were. I mean, that's actually well bigger than the average cod that the Indians were fishing. But what we know is that starting with the schooners going to steam engines and purse seines, that the capacity to fish kept increasing on the coast. And our National Marine Fisheries Service does survey trawls to see what fish exist. And they do it every spring and every fall. And The sample size any year is not so great, but if you look at it, this is a plot right now of 30 years. But if you look at this decade by decade, you see a pattern, because even by the 1970s, the cod abundance was much less than it was, let's say, in the 1800s, let alone 4,000 years ago. But nevertheless, this is the 1970s, and that's where cod are found. By the 1980s, this is what the plot looks like. By the 1990s, and by the 2000s, this is where we can kind of give up. I mean, it's you can tell what the trend is. Maine is largely a predator-free environment, and it really goes far beyond Maine. But this is just an example. Saying it goes far beyond Maine, I mean, you all know that in the 1990s, the cod stocks collapsed off of Canada and off of Georges Bank. But if you get beyond what we are in North America and you go all the way over to Europe, I got interested in this because there were some studies looking at fish predators in the United States, in the New England states. But what could I find in Europe? I couldn't find any papers suggesting that predatory fish are important on the European coast. And so that had me thinking, what about the historical accounts? And that's got me to Peter Bruegel the Elder. This is his famous painting. It's really an editorial cartoon, Big Fish Eat Little Fish. And this was from 1556. This is before Rozier was commenting on the coast of Maine. But nevertheless, notice what's spilling out of this cod's stomach includes lobsters and crabs. But the reason why you don't hear much recently, because the cod stocks were gone in Europe much sooner than they were in the New World. There were cod fishing wars in Europe in the 14 and 1500s. As a matter of fact, some of the impetus for going to places like Iceland and then on to the New World, it was the fact that their resource, the cod, were gone. And this has been expanded a lot. This is not work I did. It was published in a journal, Nature. It's a great journal, but this is using data from Japanese longline accounts, showing the abundance of harvested fish from the 1950s and 1960s to today. And it goes from the tropical Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific, subtropics, temperate Pacific. You can see what the pattern is. There's a global decline of these big fish. So it's not just something that we've noticed in North America. This is a global problem. The bottom line is big fish no longer eat little fish because we ate the big fish. And this change has changed the structure and functioning of marine ecosystems. And that's what I'm going to try to get to a little bit, because this illustrates our failure in management, but it also illustrates the importance of Cassius Ledge. You thought I'd never get there, but here we are. What I'm suggesting is this. The pristine state for coastal zones throughout the North Atlantic was a system dominated by big predatory fish, which almost every place are gone now. So if we go back to the Gulf of Maine, we have to think about that kind of history. This is a remotely operated vehicle that I was running off of Idaho, Maine. And in it, you'll see there's a couple crabs. You see these crabs, there's 3 crabs right there. That's a crab, another crab to the left. And a little bit on the left, you're going to see there's a crab there. There's a lobster on the left. Okay, what is my point? My point is that in a 23-second clip off of Idaho, we saw 9 Jonah crabs, 1 lobster, but no fish. And so I got interested in doing this. So I started tethering lobsters onto patio blocks. And I did this off of the mouth of the Damariscotta River, off the Thread of Life, for those of you know the area. I did this 3 years in a row. And there weren't any predators, but there was a cunner that had never seen itself on television before and wasn't sure what his best side is. So I was going back and forth here. But the bottom line is that none of these lobsters were getting eaten. So the lobsters are living in a predator-free environment. This is amazing. And I call this, remember we talked about these food webs, I call this trophic level dysfunction. What that means is the cod aren't extinct, but they are functionally not there. They have been overfished. So without the carnivores, you might anticipate seeing increases in prey, which include sea urchins, lobsters, and crabs. And I think you all know the lobster story. You've seen this meteoric rise in lobster abundance on the coast of Maine. But this is the only herbivore, and it had no predators, so it became abundant. And what ended up happening was the seaweed got grazed down, and we ended up with what is called sea urchin barrens. I don't like the term, but I didn't make that term up. Now, how abundant were they? Well, this is how abundant they were. This is some footage of a sea urchin barrens, which is a virtual carpet of sea urchins. And this did not go unnoticed by the sea urchin fishery. The market was really in Japan. It began in 1987 and it peaked in 1993. And at that time, its value was second only to the lobster fishery. But it's a classic boom and a bust. And that's what a boom and a bust looks like, where it goes up. And what this does is this really affects the process of herbivory. And I'm trying to show you how fishing sort of changes the structure of ecosystems. And so rather than tethering lobsters, I tethered pieces of kelp and I put it on the seafloor and I looked at how fast those kelp strips got eaten. So in 1993, before there was a fishery, about 35% of the kelp would be eaten every day. After the fishery began, that was dropping rapidly. By 1994, it was very low. And because they feed on kelp, once the urchins were gone, the kelp beds exploded. And this is some footage that I took at Pemaquid Point, right off of Pemaquid Point, 1993. And what you're seeing, those little round things are sea urchins. Sorry about the sort of Fellini quality of the movie. I'm not a professional photographer. But this was the same place 2 years later, exactly the same location. I was actually diving off of the same mooring, and the whole place had completely changed over to kelp. And if you looked around carefully, you could find, this is 1995, you could still find sea urchins here or there. This is a big one that I'm picking up right here. The fact is that I teach marine ecology at the university, and I tried diving at this site and other sites for sea urchins to show my students this major herbivore, and I did multiple dives and couldn't find a single sea urchin. So it's a pretty serious change in the ecosystem. So one way to look at this, and this is the other little bit of data I'm going to show you. I won't drown you with data here, but imagine going back to 1960 and there was no sea urchin fishery, and that's the boom and the bust of the sea urchin fishery. I was looking at the population densities of sea urchins and I saw them collapse coincident with that rise of the sea urchin fishery. And then at the same time, and this is real data, we found this rise of coastal kelp forests. So this is a clear-cut example of how a fishery can actually affect the ecosystem structure. And going back to this cartoon that I showed you before, you've had codfish and other large predators, they were overfished. And then now the herbivores have been overfished, and you're left with a seaweed community, but very little else. So exactly why am I focusing on the past? And for this, I have to hearken back to Joni Mitchell. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? And that realization that this system has so changed is why Cassius Ledge became such an eye-opener for me and for the other scientists who worked out there. And it's why I call it Maine's Lost World. That's probably the longest introduction to any talk you'll ever hear. But this is the Gulf of Maine. Those are the major currents in the Gulf of Maine. And that's where Cassius Ledge is. It's interesting because it's about the same distance from Providence, from P-Town, from Cape Ann, from Booth Bay Harbor. But also it doesn't have any direct ocean currents. It kind of has a gyre that runs right around it. And I worked there from 1984 to 1999. So it was a good stretch, although I have to admit, it's been over 20 years since I've been there. This was our time machine. And we had a group of folks who were able to take advantage of submarines to work out there, because at the time there was a federal program called the National Undersea Research Program. We wrote proposals, they were peer reviewed, and we got them funded, and they funded the submarines that got us out to Cassius Ledge. The Cassius Ledge in the shallows, where we were working, was 110 feet. We had a 13-minute bottom time, but with submarines, you had, of course, a lot more time down there. And what the whole adventure was that I would be sitting in the front bubble. That's me. It's a 5-foot bubble. And then I had room in the back, and this is a lobsterman. This is Dave Cousins. Some of you may know Dave Cousins. He was the president of the Maine Lobstermen's Association for a number of years. And I gave lobstermen a ride in the back of the submarine because otherwise, there wasn't nobody else in there, and they would be able to see the seafloor. But this was a great, it had video cameras, it had a manipulator arm, and this is another shot. And now this is actually, that last one was actually on the coast of Maine. This is actually out at Cassius Ledge. If I was more clever, I'd know how to edit these movies. I don't, but this is showing what the submarine looks like because we were scuba diving out there. And this is the submarine, and actually the visibility out at Cassius Ledge can be absolutely terrific, almost tropical. But this is what I wanted you to see. This is what we were seeing at Cassius Ledge. This was nothing like anything I had ever seen on the coast of Maine. Almost nobody alive today had ever seen anything like this. This is much more like what you might see in the best tropical settings. There's absolutely nothing to the idea that fish were not able to live in northern climates. Absolutely, they could live in northern climates. Sometimes these pollock got so dense, we had to turn on the lights just to see the seafloor. And when we got closer, you see those white things. Those are anemones. We had anemones. We had brachiopods, which are like primitive clam-like critters. Then there's kelp. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the kelp in a moment. We had cod, cusk, wolffish. It was a sea of fish, and I'm guessing this is what it would have looked like if you could be a scuba diver 4,000 years ago on the coast of Maine. So this is the really exciting. There's a shark. That's a blue shark. It swam right past me while I was scuba diving, which warms you right up. But these videos do not do justice to the real beauty of what was there. The corallines are pink and the anemones are a variety of colors. There's several different colors of sea stars, including blood stars that are red. And I'm gonna just leave that for just a second because all of my clips involve showing you a launch. And as I said, if I was smarter, I would figure out how to just skip the launches. But what I want to show is we did a bunch of dives, and this is just another dive. You can look at how craggy the rocks are there, and that's actually important for why the fish persist there. But this is some footage that we took showing the cod. The cod were good size, they were abundant. That's a lot of cod. And this is Cassius Ledge at its finest. So other people who are much better photographers, like Brian Scarry, loaned me this photograph of the anemones, and you can just see how stunning they are. John Whitman at Brown University, one of the major researchers out there. This is a photograph that he took. This is some of the work that John was doing, and this is from 1987. So again, these are all projects that were funded by the National Undersea Research Program. But it's one of those things you kind of have to be there, because I have to say, I've traveled all over the world, but almost no place is more stunning than what I've seen at Cassius Ledge. And I do encourage you all to go to the exhibit. The surrounded video exhibit really made me feel like I was there again. My wife had to pull me out of that exhibit. It was bringing me back to the years I worked out there. Well, there is a little more science. I guess I lied about how much science, but what do we know about Cassius Ledge? It's a species diversity hotspot. This is a study that shows with a heat plot, the redder colors are high. The number of species are peaking right on the Cassius Ledge complex, and then the number of animals is peaking. So both in terms of the population densities and the number of species, it's a hotspot. And Cassius Ledge, Maine's lost world. It's isolated. It really, most of the coast, from Nova Scotia, Bay of Fundy, all the way down to Cape Cod, those are all in various currents. The Nova Scotia coastal current, the Eastern Maine coastal current, the Western Maine coastal current. But Cassius Ledge is in the middle. And what that means is it's hard for larvae to get to Cassius Ledge. The population is able to live there and persist there and sort of become self-sustaining. So it's really unique. This is a paper that John Whitman wrote, but it does show better than any of my pictures some of the kelp forests, and also that bottom picture shows the fish occupying the kelp. But this is a really unique kelp forest. This is a paper that I published. It turns out that the kelp forest at Cassius Ledge is one of the deepest kelp forests in the world, bar none. And it's a great habitat for fish. But as I said, it's evolutionarily, there's a certain degree of isolation because it's 80 miles offshore. So think about isolated islands like the Galapagos, and it allows for a certain amount of individuality to evolve. And a very tantalizing one had to do with kelp. First of all, the picture on the right shows the size of the kelp on Cassius Ledge. Some of those kelp fronds were 30 feet long. I don't see anything that big on the coast of Maine. But the kelp that this fellow is holding, this fellow is a kelp geneticist, and he ran genetic studies on the kelp we're finding at depth. And it's his opinion that this is actually a new species. And unfortunately, it has not been published yet. But all I'm saying is that is a really interesting and tantalizing aspect of science. The other thing is that some other publications, this is Graham Sherwood, who's at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and John Grabowski, who was there at the time, but is now down at Northeastern. They looked at cod from all over and noticed color variations, and turns out that the cod on Cassius Ledge is this unique red cod that's found out there. Again, the potential for either being genetically distinct or possibly because of the diet that it has gives it that kind of color. So predatory fish such as cod, pollock, cunner, wolffish were abundant, and they were big. While we were diving, some of the ship's crew were fishing, which made me a little nervous, frankly. But this guy caught a 40-pound cod. So there were big cod there. But what does that mean? I mean, we know that there were big cod on the coast of Maine in the past. And so we set up, we proposed and got funded to do those tethering of lobsters, but now out at Cassius Ledge. And that yellow that you see is a video camera. We just passed one of the patio blocks. These are the same size patio blocks that you saw in my coastal studies. And you look at all the fish, and then there's that unique kelp. And what's really interesting is that we did this for a couple of years, and we tethered a variety of sizes of lobsters, just asking the question, what is the predation potential? We know that lobsters normally could live in shelters, but the ones on the coast, when we tethered them, they didn't get eaten. Here, 75% of all the lobsters got eaten every day, and we lost 5 patio blocks, and we think big fish just dragged them away. So the data that I ended up publishing compared 3 sites on the coast where we used cameras to show that the abundance and the body sizes were small. And we found for small, medium, and large lobsters that the attacks were only on the small lobsters. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. But then when we got out to Ammon Rock, which is on Cassius Ledge, and we looked at those attacks, we found actually all size classes were attacked, but the largest lobsters were attacked the most, which is really fascinating. It's really important. The bottom line is that big fish can attack big lobsters, but big fish are ecologically extinct on the coast of Maine. Halibut, cod, wolffish are all really rare on the coast of Maine. And so if you think back, the movies of the past heralded the big fish, but maybe the movies of the future are just going to be heralding the tiny fish that exist. But what are the implications of a world dominated by tiny fish? You actually saw one on that video clip earlier from the coast. This is a little lobster on a leash, and there are several of them on that patio block that's closest to you there on the screen. And this is work I did with Rick Wally. As a matter of fact, his PhD dissertation was on this stuff. But you'll notice that little lobsters are flopping around, but the little cunner come right in. There's more than 1 per meter square of those little cunner. And so baby lobsters have a very high attack rate. Their survival on those blocks lasts in minutes. And when we plot this, what we see is this. Okay, more science, I'm sorry. But this is the body size along the bottom, along the x-axis, going from 0 to 100. Sorry, it's in millimeters, but you get the point. And then the attack rate, the number of attacks per hour. And what this shows is the attack rate for the babies is really high, and then it drops down to virtually zero. So by the time a baby lobster gets to be about 2 years old, it's immune to predators on the coast of Maine today. But Cassius ledge shows us prey vulnerability in the past with big predators around, and it's a really different pattern. So what we see is that lobsters are probably vulnerable for more like 10 years at least. And so that may well be why in the Indian Middens, we simply were not seeing lobsters and crabs because there are way too many predators out there. And big predators can eat big invertebrates, lobsters and sea urchins. They're big. The lobster is by weight is the heaviest invertebrate in the world, gets to be 50 pounds. But these wolffish, which are, they really have a face only a mother could love. But this is a wolffish eating sea urchins, and they've got a big bony mouth. They also love to eat lobsters. You saw it in that other video. So we had a number of very big predators on the coast of Maine, quite capable of eating all of the invertebrates, which is the reason why at Cassius Ledge, we during the day, we see almost no invertebrates. Now look at this. Watch how well the wolffish glides. Kind of like a brick. Anyway, so what do we have now? What I'm suggesting is that our data, and we published this, is that the apex predators on Cassius Ledge are there, and that their role as carnivores seems to be very strong because sea urchins, lobsters, and crabs are in the daytime are all really rare. Doing some night work, John Whitman and Ken Siebens showed some crabs scurrying about, but nothing like what we see in Maine, like the video I showed you from Isle of Ho. The other thing that we see is because the carnivores keep the herbivores at bay, we see abundant seaweed. But this is different because this is abundant seaweed and predatory fish. So why fish still dominate at Cassius Ledge? For one thing, it is a really productive environment. It has internal waves. It's got a lot of plankton, but it also was protected. You have to realize that this is a mountain within the sea, and it comes up abruptly. You saw it in those videos with the submarines, that if you're a dragger and you just have a net that normally goes along the seafloor, you can't run it over something like Cassius Ledge without getting it hung up. As a matter of fact, in our submarine work and diving, we came across ghost nets where people tried to drag nets over Cassius Ledge. They got snagged. They ended up having to cut the lines. As it happens, and this was mostly after we got started doing our work, rock hopping gear became more popular. And that's basically like having tires that allow it to hop over rocks. But I talked to a fisherman out there who said that he really didn't want to fish out there because of what he saw, what came up. He saw the kelp forests. Yes, he was getting fish, but so much of the ecosystem was being torn up. And the fishing community and managers agreed actually to protect Cassius Ledge. And it is currently protected from commercial fishing in a small area. There's interest in having a larger area protected. The reproductive cod are actually found in the deeper water. And so it would make sense to protect not only Cassius Ledge, but also Cassius Basin. But recreational fishing can still go on there. So that's most of my story right there. We have to ask the question, what does Cassius Ledge future looks like? And all I can say is that I'm hopeful, but my crystal ball is a bit cloudy. I can tell you that subsequent work that John Whitman's done, the fish fauna seems to be holding up pretty well. So that is really great. And getting back to the title of my talk, where I said, wouldn't it be great if there was a place where ancient predators still existed, as did in the Lost World? And I'd say it does, and it does at Cassius Ledge. So Cassius Ledge may be Maine's Lost World. Fish predators remain relatively abundant. I showed you the evidence of that. Their prey remain rare, and this is exactly what we saw in archaeological studies 4,000 years ago. The bigger picture among conservationists is discussing how we partition management into a triad. And what I mean by that is that if it's true that if we had an entire Gulf of Maine, loaded with fish predators, that we wouldn't have lobsters and crabs, there'd be obvious economic consequences. And so what this triad tries to do is develop three different ways of managing. First is wild harvests, and usually, and certainly currently in Maine, that's virtually, it's almost everywhere. Wild harvesting is allowed. But number two is production, and in the ocean, that's aquaculture, which is growing in Maine for sure. The third is wilderness, and that's really what's generally absent. Cassius ledge may be our last best chance to preserve an ocean wilderness, and it's you know, the best thing we can do is to protect it. And so with that, I would like to just simply once again thank, you know, many groups that allowed all this research to go forward. The National Undersea Research Program, it died years ago, but it was a wonderful opportunity. Brian Scarry with National Geographic, his photography, John Whitman at Brown, Peter Auster and Ivar Babb at University of Connecticut, Conservation Law Foundation have been very keen on preservation of Cassius ledge. University of Maine, of course, and our research teams. And also Joni Mitchell, because don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And with that, I thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
All right. Thank you, Bob. That was really great. And so if everybody would like to, you can.
I can stop the share at this point.
Oh yeah, if you want to stop the share, and then people, we invite you to turn your cameras on. If you want to kind of join this conversation, you can write your questions in the chat, or if you don't want to write a whole big question, if you kind of put either emoji or wave your hand, then we can find you and unmute you so that you can ask your questions. And while we wait for everybody to kind of process everything and come up with, see if they want to ask your questions, I can start with one that I thought of during your presentation. Can you just expand a little bit more on why you did so much research on Cassius ledge versus like other ledges like Jeffries or Stillwagon Bank? And kind of the second part of that question is, does that have to do with, is there a difference in the biodiversity, and what is it about Cassius ledge versus other ledges that kind of show those differences?
Well, when the National Undersea Research Program started up, several of us got together, John Whitman, Ken Siebens, myself in particular, and we wanted to use this opportunity, having, a 220-foot vessel and a submarine, to go to the hardest place to study. Phippines Ledge, Stillwagon Bank, they're actually, relatively speaking, closer. You can get day boats to go out there, and there had been a fair amount of research done out there. And there are some similarities, a few similarities, except that Cassius ledge had a much bigger fish fauna, and it's much more abrupt, so that I think the impact that it would have to people who wanted to fish out there, first of all, you're going to have a relatively big boat, and you're going to have to put a lot of gear down, and that's going to create a problem for the fishers, which gave us this abundance that we saw. And I have to say, the first couple of years working out there, John Whitman, who had worked at these other ledges as well, and we did some exploratory work, I will say, in a number of other spots, including Mount Desert Rock, but nothing was similar to Cassius ledge. And on a good day of diving, as I said, the visibility can be extraordinary. So you're getting in the water, and it's virtually tropical. So the Undersea Research Program gave us that opportunity, and once we started setting up experiments there, then we were kind of locked into going back. So I'm glad that we made that choice. It wasn't the only place we studied. I will point that out. We had a number of coastal offshore sites. Matinicus Rock is one of our sites, and as I said, Mount Desert and a few other places. But Cassius had this unique aspect to it.
Awesome. So we're getting some questions in and some comments. So I'll just read them. So we have Anna Thompson mentioned, fantastic. Thank you. Such an interesting presentation. Karen Richards, fantastic. Thanks. I'm glad to hear this area is protected from commercial fishing. I hope recreation fishing doesn't cause too much damage or that additional protections will be implemented if it does start to show damage. And I don't know if you have any comments or if you know anything about that
Yeah,
currently.
I mean, there was a paper in Science a couple years ago that actually refuted the idea that recreational fishing doesn't have much of an impact on fish stocks. It does, and in particular, it tends to affect the size structure, which I hope I made the case that that's really important. So personally, I think Cassius Ledge is a relatively small area, and if we could designate it as wilderness, and just the way we do on Baxter State Park, and just make it a place where the human footprint is minimalized, it would be worth doing because it's so unique, and it's really a relatively small area, and there's plenty of other places where you can fish. So I know that doesn't make, I mean, I'm a recreational fisher myself, but it's simply not, there are so many studies that just show how quickly you lose the size structure of fish stocks that get fished, that I would love to see it be a no fishing zone.
Great, thanks. All right, so we have a question from Gina. She says, I'm wondering how is part of it preserved? Oh, I just moved. Sorry, I'm wondering how is part of it preserved and what would be the process to preserve that area you suggested? So kind of touching on the what you just talked about, but how could we get, what steps could be taken to preserve it against all types of fishing?
Yeah, there are a lot of folks who are much more on top of this than I am. And I do know that the Conservation Law Foundation is interested in this, and a fellow named Peter Oster, who is now Mystic Seaport Museum, I believe. And there are federal designations that you can make, usually through National Marine Fisheries Service, that declare places as no-take zones. Now, as you may know, there are several no-take zones for codfish on Georges Bank, which are kind of emergency closures that happened in 1994 to try to bring codfish back. But this would not be an emergency closure, and it's actually, I think, going to be harder because it's one that's basically based for conservation. And certainly, I wouldn't be the first person to point out that in most countries, conservation is done of marine settings is done by a conservation group, but the National Marine Fisheries Service falls under commerce. And the idea of the National Marine Fisheries Service was to develop fisheries. And so there is kind of a little bit of a conflict as far as that goes. And I'd love to have the debate. I just think that it would be worth closing, but it's not easy. And I know that it was proposed for monument status, and the monument status I think would have helped prevent it from being fished. And the monument designation is supposed to be to preserve historically important areas. And I would make a case based on what I just said that it is historically important, but it was the first one to come off of the table when they were doing the monument designations that exist outside of Georges Bank.
Great. All right. Robert Foster wants to know if there is currently any research that is being conducted on Cassius Ledge.
Not that I know of in situ. And I know that John Whitman has been able to go back a few times. I was in touch with him. He loaned me the photographs that I showed of his, and he hasn't been able to get out there. Look, it's not an easy place to work. Besides being 80 miles offshore, in the middle of summer, water temperature is 8 degrees. And that would be temperature in the 40s Fahrenheit. there are internal waves that break over that. And so you have to have a line that goes down to the seafloor, and you have to keep your hand on the line. From that line, there are lines that radiate out that are anchored to the seafloor. And you never want to be very far from one of those lines, because when an internal wave crests, the current is over 4 knots. A person can't swim against a 1 knot current. A 4 knot current would mean you're 80 miles offshore and you're blown off of your site. There's a very good chance you're not going to go home ever. So there's a lot of safety precautions, and we were always very mindful of that. And as I said, for scuba diving, we had a 13-minute time on the seafloor. So we had to work incredibly efficiently. We had to put down all these, we had epoxy putty, we put down all of these anchors for working. And I can remember surfacing and just being like a flag flapping in a gale as the current was trying to pull me away, and I just go hand over hand up the ascent line. So it's not a trivial place for scuba diving.
Awesome. So we're getting a lot of questions. So all right. So I'm gonna, Amanda, I have a very long comment from Captain Bill Tranter. Sorry if I mispronounced, and we're actually going to have him speak instead of me just reading it. So if Amanda, if you want to unmute, and then we'll get to a couple more questions after.
Hello.
Oh, awesome. Do you want to turn on your camera? You don't have to if you don't want to.
I'm working on it.
Okay.
There you go.
Awesome.
All right, turn up a little bit so I can hear it. But
Okay.
how are we doing?
Good. How are you?
So I most certainly don't want to say this in a negative way, but it's definitely an observation on my side to say it's tough with all the information being this old about Cash's Ledge and stuff, because things can change so much in 25 years or so. So that's just one little statement. I would love to see new information from Cash's, and I heard you say that there's nothing going on as far as research now. But my other comment and observations were basically here near shore. I run a fishing charter in Harpswell, and near shore we see a lot of red cod. And in my fishing community, we pretty much consider red cod to be only a near shore cod. So I was kind of surprised that you saw them out there, and that your perception was that it's opposite of what we see. We do a lot of fishing on Platt's Bank, Jeffrey's Ledge. Those are prime ground fishing, recreational ground fishing areas. And so when we catch cod out there, they're the brown cod, and inside of the red cod. And there's lots of conversation about that they have evolved basically the beginning of speciation, splitting. And so I thought that was interesting. The other part about the inshore stuff is talking about predators for lobsters and crabs. I know that seals and striped bass both eat lobsters and crabs. In particular, the lobstermen really hate seals because
I do know that. I spent 20 years working with the lobstering community, and I've been on sea sampling on 250 lobster boats on the coast of Maine. I think what the observation is that often when shorts or even V-notch lobsters are thrown back, that seals will pick them up in their mouth. However, I do not know of a single documented case of a seal actually eating one. Now, I'm not saying that having it in their mouth they may clamp down, but one seal specialist was telling me, biologist was saying that they have very delicate stomach linings, and they simply, our seals simply don't feed on, they're fish eaters. That's what he said. I did want
So they don't have the ability, basically.
yeah, but I've been out on boats and I've watched the seals, like grab them. It's just like, you go to SeaWorld or something and then they're grabbing these things as they go up and I know that a lot of lobstermen were saying that the seals were a problem, but the National Marine Fisheries Service, and they've done a lot of necropsies. There is not a single example of a seal with a lobster in its gut.
Well, that's great to know.
And I wanted to just, there's 2 points. One is Whitman and Lamb in 2018 published a paper on Cassius Ledge, and their most recent visit was 2016. So it's better than when I was there last. But what I found interesting was the data that they showed there hasn't been a significant decline in the abundance or the size of the cod out there. Getting back to the color of cod, I'm at a disadvantage because I'm colorblind, but I do know that paper. And Sherwood and Grabowski do say that the color may in fact be just related to feeding in an area of kelp. So but on the other hand, you do have all size ranges of cod from 1-year-old to, I showed you the 40-year-old ones. And so there is some thought that they're able to reproduce and the babies are able to keep going at Cassius Ledge, but they can only do that because there's a gyre there. When you're working along the coast, if you're at Cape Ann or something, any of the larvae that are released there are going to be following the Western Maine coastal current. So they're going to go someplace else. So that's one of the advantages, I think, of Cassius Ledge. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I said in my comment, I'm absolutely a supporter of protecting caches, and if it was expanded, that would be okay by me too. As recreational fishermen, very few get to go out there because it's a long run, and
yeah.
Hopefully we're going to run out there at some point, but it would be a overnight trip.
Yep.
I did have one other question. I lost. I totally lost it. Maybe. So at caches, the cod and other fish they have a wide range of size from what you were saying, correct?
Yeah, we do. Yep.
Do you know why cod inshore tend to be all small, and even inshore where nobody's dragging, they just seem to all be very, very small?
Yeah, and I've done a lot of research using Maine inshore trawl data, and they do size frequency distribution. So you see a lot. Some years you see a lot of 1-year-olds. Sometimes you see 2-year-olds. You almost never see 3-year-olds, which is exactly what you're saying. This is where I think seals might be playing a role, because seal abundance, according to the seal specialists, are more abundant now than they've ever been. As I said, they are fish eaters. They tend to swallow their prey whole. They can, herring and mackerel are favored food for them, but any juvenile cod that's 1, 2, or 3 years old would be easy for them to swallow. So,
interesting. Yeah.
Carl Wilson with Maine's Department of Marine Resources, he was resistant to that idea, but recently he was saying that he might be starting to believe that seals are having that effect. Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries does a sentinel survey. They've been doing it for well over a decade, and they're having a hard time finding anything but juvenile cod.
Well, thank you very much for that. I won't take up any more of your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
All right, so we have enough time for one question, maybe one more question. Let me find all the questions. Sorry.
And Katie, while you're looking at that, I want to go ahead and take a moment to thank everyone for being here. We have a number of additional lectures and panels coming up throughout the year, including everyone from Dr. Sherwood, who was mentioned earlier in this presentation, to Ben Martins from the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. We're just really excited to be able to be having these conversations about this really interesting topic.
Great. So one comment, Ashley wrote, "Thank you, a very informative presentation, brings back memories of jigging for codfish out of," I'm so sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but a harbor back in the early 50s. My ancestors relied on the cod to feed the family. And then last question from John Zittel, what would the impact on the fish populations you discussed of the warming and the more acidic Gulf of Maine? So what would that warming and acidic Gulf of Maine have the impact had on the fish that you discussed?
Right. The paper that I mentioned, that Whitman and Lamb paper that came out in 2018, explicitly was looking at differences, the change that resulted from warming. Out there, it's been modest compared to in coastal zones of Maine. And among the things that are very affected by warmer temperatures are kelp. The kelp down in southern Gulf of Maine, like Isle Shoals and York, have declined significantly in the last decade, presumably due to warming. One of the things that I didn't mention, it was actually in one of the figures where I showed the mountain within the sea, is that Cassius Ledge resides in Maine intermediate water, and there's 3 layers. The top water is the surface water. That's what's warming up incredibly. Maine intermediate water, which gets cold every winter. It is, that's why when I was diving in August, it was 40 degrees. So it is warming, but it's way below temperatures that are stressful for most of those critters. Whereas coastal Maine, especially the shallows, that's a different story. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for starting us off with such a great lecture. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I hope that you can come and see some of our other lectures as we continue kind of learning about Cassius Ledge and everything connected to it. So
just one thing I'd like to add, and that is if anybody would like to get in touch with me, follow up, you can get my email address. It's just steneck@maine.edu, and I would love to continue the discussion because I have a lot to learn and I can learn from you. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.